All right. Hey, everyone. So we are now going to be transitioning into our final focus for the semester. Our final chapter here that we're going to discuss is this whole idea about building an organization that is capable of good strategy execution. So we have talked a lot about the importance of designing and organizing a really effective strategy. Honestly, that's what we spent most of our time considering, right? But remember how when we started off early in the semester, we talked about this process of strategy making, strategy executing? Well, we're on to the execution part of things at this point. And maybe you're thinking, if we put a good enough plan together, really think this thing out, seems like execution should be the easy part, right? Well, might even cause you, let's say, maybe to think that the execution stage isn't even that critical or that important, since you got such a great plan in place at this point, right? But you remember right here, seeing what Richard Kovacevic said here. He was a former Wells Fargo CEO. He said essentially, no, a second-rate strategy that's executed well will still outperform even the best strategy if it's executed poorly, right? Well, in short, yeah, the execution stage, what we're talking about here, very important, but don't take my word for it. Let's talk a little bit more about this idea. So it is, let's just specify a little bit about this crafting or planning our strategy versus executing it, and what causes these difficulties or differences between these two very critical steps of this whole process we've talked about for an entire semester at this point, right? It is much easier for us to develop than to execute a sound strategy, and for a number of reasons, right? Because first and foremost, a very wide array of managerial activities have to be attended to when you are executing, right? The strategy crafting element, it may be, we have to take all those things into consideration, but in order to execute, all those things really need to come into place. We have to think of all these managerial activities that come into play. There are many, many, many ways to put a strategic initiative in place and keep things moving. So what path do we take and how do we do that practically and in an applied manner here? Along the way too, it's just naive to think that things will always work out the way that we planned them in our strategy crafting portion of the entire process. Difficult issues are going to crop up often. They have to be resolved. And they often have to be, resolved dynamically alongside, in tandem with trying to implement all these other elements of the strategy alongside of it, right? So implementing and executing our strategy really requires that our firm as a whole, our entire management team, our employees, all of our value chain members, elements of that, all of these people all have to be actively involved in the strategy execution process. They have to be, right? Top level managers, they have to lead the process. They've got to orchestrate these big initiatives and get everybody on board. Our middle level and our lower level managers, they have to see that all these things that are trying to be put into place, they have to make sure and ensure that those things go well in their areas of the organization to support the overall high level strategy. Employees, they've all got to perform their individual roles completely, and competently, and be given the resources to do those, and be trained in the capabilities in order to ensure that they do those things efficiently, because every single level is important to supporting that highest level strategy for our organization, and everybody's got to be involved and everybody's got to be committed to it. The tough thing about our strategy execution process is that it involves every single part of our enterprise, right? All our value chain activities, all our organizational units, all of our functional areas, all of our company personnel. And you can imagine this is not an easy undertaking. Just from the sense of, teaching at a university, just to even be told in a class of mine of 50 people or something like that, you got to have everybody on board and dedicated to what's going on in that class. And I'd sit there and say, you got to be nuts. I'll never get everybody on board or have a good attitude about things, like even with 50 people. So you can imagine how stressful this can be in these enormous organizations where we have so many moving parts, so many functional areas, so many departments, so many people trying to get it all together and orchestrate it effectively to execute this thing. Oh yeah, it's a big undertaking. So use this framework for executing strategy. We won't walk through every single one of these and exhaust it, but these are all the different elements that go into executing a strategy from a high level perspective. So yeah, quite a few things we got to take into consideration here, right? But the most important element about this is right here. The most important thing we have to remember when we look at these critical elements for good strategy execution is just this. The managerial approach to implementing and executing a strategy always has to be customized to fit the particulars of our firm, of our situation, of our department, of our functional area, whatever it might be, right? Easily said, there is no single managerial recipe for executing our strategy in all situations for all types of strategies or for all kinds of managers or employee and personnel makeup. This is a really key thing we have to remember about, what failed strategies all have in common, and that is it's often because they're poorly executed. They don't take consideration for this idea and understand that all situations, all firms, all strategies, all functional areas, all people, they pose individual differences in these situations that are meaningful, that can impact how well we can execute a given strategy. But at the end of the day, we still have to devise an agenda for how we execute this thing. So essentially, as managers, if we can take away anything from this, we got to remember every single time as a manager, when we are out here trying to implement strategy, we got to remember this idea. It is every single member's duty to ensure that this execution goes well. And so it only makes sense. A lot of the responsibility is going to fall on us as managers to ensure that that happens, right? We have to assess what our organization needs to do differently and better in order to execute that strategy with a very high degree of proficiency and meet or beat those target levels of financial and strategic performance that we've set. So we have to continuously ask ourselves this question: what needs to be done in an area I'm responsible for so that I can make sure that my actions, the things that I'm doing and I'm pushing forward, are supporting in part the firm's chosen strategy. And I'm doing everything I can to ensure that that execution goes well. Because if I can, we will see these signals we've talked about so many times throughout the semester, right? Because if we're doing it correctly and each of us as managers takes on this responsibility appropriately, we will hopefully have this conceptual strategy move us forward to meeting or beating our performance targets and performing those critical value chain activities that we've focused on that are critical to our strategic execution. We're seeing those moving more proficiently, getting better operational excellence, all these things. But we as managers, we have to remember, we take the brunt of this responsibility to make sure these things go well and ensure that this strategy we've spent all this time executing, crafting, will be executed appropriately.